To a few of us here today, this is a solemn and most momentous occasion. And yet in the history of our nation, it is a commonplace occurrence. The orderly transfer of authority, as called for in the Constitution, routinely takes place as it has for almost 2 centuries, and few of us stop to think how unique we really are. In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle.
Why is Reagan's first inaugural address important? It's important because to understand the trajectory of current American politics, you have to understand Ronald Reagan. Reagan essentially takes the conservative movement and he changes it into the one that we know today. Today's Republican Party and the conservative movement that drives it is essentially the child of Reagan and the success that Reagan had in the 1980s. So Ronald Reagan originally makes his bones as an actor in California, and then he's elected president in the 1980 presidential election, and he's president from 1980 to 1988. He's followed by George H.W. Bush, and then H.W. Bush is followed by Clinton. Clinton is followed by W. Bush, and then W. Bush is followed by Obama. So Reagan's president from 1980 to 1988. And while he's president, he's an extremely successful conservative Republican. He's also known as the Great Communicator. That's the nickname the press gives to Reagan and that historians basically agree with. And you'll see when you watch the video that's assigned for today, which is Reagan's first inaugural address. It's the speech you give right after you get elected and then sworn into the presidency. You turn and you give a nice little speech. These speeches are considered very important for setting the tone and the goals of your president. So this inaugural address, which is mercifully not that long, gives us a clear vision of Reagan's abilities as a communicator and of his political ideology, which is a sort of positive conservatism that sees America as driven primarily by moral concern. Moral concerns are very important to Reagan, and introducing moral concern into politics is a central feature of the conservative movement that he pushes forward. And it has today, of course, taken over the modern conservative movement in its various guises. In many ways, Trump is sort of a repudiation of putting your moral concerns central in your politics. Trump is a relatively amoral figure, and yet he is now the effective head of the conservative movement and the Republican Party. And so Trump is something of a reversal of the trend that Reagan started. But he's also, in other respects, a continuation of this trend in that he, like Reagan, got famous on TV, got famous in this fairly superficial way, projecting a certain specific image of what it means to be a leader. And so that's also, there's some really classic moments in this speech. You can see how as soon as Reagan starts speaking, he has this sort of like calm, confident presence, which I think is why he's seen as such a great communicator. If I can find, yes, there's this famous line here.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
This is in a sense, the popularization of this incredibly common way of thinking we have today in the conservative movement of the virtues of small government, that government should lower its total tax revenues, it should lower its total expenditures, it should have in general less capacity to do things, not more capacity to do things. This is a classic conservative argument. Another line that goes along by the anti-tax advocate Grover Norquist, who said, "I'm not in favor of abolishing the government. I just want to shrink it down to the size where I can drown it in a bathtub." So this is the idea of shrinking government, because the size of government interferes with liberty. Now, as a practical matter, what has actually transpired when conservatives who say they want to shrink the government get into office is that, in general, what has happened is you have not seen an overall shrinkage of the size of government. Let me pull up size of government by presidency. What you have seen instead is when people say they want to shrink the government, they mean they want to cut social services and they want to cut spending on things like education and healthcare. So as you can see, government spending by president or political party has very little relationship to the person's party and how much government expands. You know, if all the conservatives since 1980 getting in wanted to shrink the government, you would see the red bars on this graph be sloping downward quite aggressively, and the blue bars on the graph sloping upward quite aggressively. But instead, what you see is kind of a weak relationship. You know, the bars go up under the Republican presidents, or the red bars on the graph, and the bars they also often go up under the blue. What is happening is not an overall reduction in government expenditures or government spending, but rather what you see is something of a horizontal shifting of spending away from social services under Republican presidents toward things like military expenditures and tax cuts, and then to a degree the reverse under Democratic presidents. One other thing Reagan got famous for was opposing the Soviet Union during the Cold War in strong and charismatic terms. So you have a couple of these lines in this speech. He says, for examples,
to those neighbors and allies who share our freedom, we will strengthen our historic ties and assure them of our support and firm commitment. We will match loyalty with loyalty. We will strive for mutually beneficial relations. We will not use our friendship to impose on their sovereignty, for our own sovereignty is not for sale. As for the enemies of freedom, those who are potential adversaries, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. We will negotiate for it, sacrifice for it. We will not surrender for it, now or ever. Forbearance should never be misunderstood. Our reluctance for conflict should not be misjudged as a failure of will. When action is required to preserve our national security, we will act. We will maintain sufficient strength to prevail if need be, knowing that if we do so, we have the best chance of never having to use that strength. Above all, we must realize that no arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. It is a weapon our adversaries in today's world do not have. It is a weapon that we as Americans do have.
That's just a few things I wanted to pull out of Reagan's inaugural address. Obviously, you can watch it at your leisure along with this video. It is significant because of the way it reflects the new birth of the conservative movement in politics, and the way that conservative movement, which Reagan kind of popularized, gave rise to, and ushered into power, still affects the politics that we have today, essentially. Now, on to the Federalist Papers. Let's talk about the Federalist Papers 67 through 70. So we already know from earlier classes, the Federalist Papers were written to convince people to ratify the Constitution. The Constitution had come out of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and then some states were waffling about ratifying it. And so John Jay, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton got together, and they wrote a series of essays, basically op-eds in the local newspapers in New York, trying to convince the people of New York to ratify the Constitution. They did this by addressing people's concerns with the Constitution, the stuff they didn't like about the Constitution. This series of Federalist Papers, 67 through 70, is Alexander Hamilton, he's the author of these ones, trying to justify why the presidency is set up the way it is in the Constitution. These are important papers because it's very rare in the history of politics that you get the person who actually had a hand in writing the Constitution sitting down and saying, let me just explain and defend what I meant in an extended series of essays about the Constitution. And so as you can imagine, these essays are incredibly influential for understanding what the founders intended when they wrote the Constitution and how we should interpret it today, and what the role of the presidency was intended to be when the Constitution was designed. So here's what they say. Federalist 67 says, it's basically Hamilton getting mad at people saying that the president is a tyrant. So he says, look, the president is not a tyrant. Stop saying he's a tyrant. He's not a tyrant. Here are some examples why. For example, the Senate has to approve his choices for his own cabinet and on the Supreme Court. Would a tyrant have a check like that, where the Senate has to approve everyone he picks to help him out? No. Therefore, he's not a tyrant. Federalist 68 argues that the Electoral College is good and wise. It's an effective way to separate the popular passions of the people from the actual means of selecting the president. That one didn't age very well, but here we are. Federalist 69 says the president is different from a king because all he can really do is control the military, but he has a variety of limitations around that. He's got term limits, for example, so he has to stand for re-election every 4 years, and he can't declare war on his own. Congress has to do that. That second point aged in a very complicated way, as we've discussed a little bit, but that is Hamilton's argument. Federalist 70 says that we need a unitary executive for accountability to defend against legislative encroachment and to provide energetic leadership. So in the same way that it's a lot harder for a mass group of people to seize power than it is for one person to become a tyrant or a king, it's also a lot harder for a mass group of people like Congress to provide energetic, clear leadership and direction than it is for one person to do that. So again, Hamilton says, having one person gives you accountability. It's a lot harder to pass the buck when you are the one person in charge. It defends against legislative encroachment. This means Congress taking powers that the president himself should have. When Congress takes these powers from the president, that is a form of encroachment. Remember, the founders thought that Congress would be the strongest branch. So a lot of them are worried that Congress gets too powerful, so they're setting up barriers and making arguments for why you would need a strong president to counterbalance what they think will be a strong Congress. Now, we know from American history it doesn't really play out like that, but these were the concerns in the 1780s when this was written. And then again, energy, some type of energetic leadership.
I'm the son of a black man from Kenya and a white woman from Kansas. I was raised with the help of a white grandfather who survived a depression to serve in Patton's army during World War II, and a white grandmother who worked on a bomber assembly line at Fort Leavenworth while he was overseas. I've gone to some of the best schools in America, and I've lived in one of the world's poorest nations. I am married to a black American who carries within her the blood of slaves and slave owners, an inheritance we pass on to our two precious daughters. I have brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, uncles, and cousins of every race and every hue scattered across 3 continents. And for as long as I live, I will never forget that in no other country on earth is my story even possible. It's a story that hasn't made me the most conventional of candidates, but it is a story that has seared into my genetic makeup the idea that this nation is more than the sum of its parts, that out of many, we are truly one.
In 2008, the Democratic presidential primary is underway. The contest is between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And for a long time, Hillary Clinton had been seen as the presumptive nominee, the front runner in the race. But Obama won a surprise victory in the state of Iowa, and after doing so, it became steadily clear that he was actually potentially going to win the Democratic nomination from Hillary Clinton, which was not something anyone had previously thought possible. However, just when it seemed like Obama was finally going to win this nomination, become the first black nominee of a major party for president, these tapes emerged from the church he had been attending in Chicago for decades.
Where governments lie, God does not lie. Where governments change, God does not change. And I'm through now. But let me leave you with one more thing. Governments fail. The government in this text, comprised of Caesar, Quirinius, Pontius Pilate, Pontius Pilate. The Roman government failed. The British government used to rule from east to west. The British government had a Union Jack. She colonized Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and Hong Kong. Her navies ruled the 7 seas all the way down to the tip of Argentina in the Falklands. But the British government failed. The Russian government failed. The Japanese government failed. The German government failed. And the United States of America government, when it came to treating her citizens of Indian descent fairly, she failed. She put them on reservations. When it came to treating her citizens of Japanese descent fairly, she failed. She put them in internment prison camps. When it came to treating the citizens of African descent fairly, America failed. She put them in chains. The government put them on slave quarters, put them on auction blocks, put them in cotton fields, put them in inferior schools, put them in substandard housing, put them in scientific experiments, put them in the lowest paying jobs, put them outside the equal protection of the law, kept them out of their racist bastions of higher education, and locked them into positions of hopelessness and helplessness. The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America? No, no, no. Not God Bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating her citizens as less than human. God damn America as long as she tries to act like she is God and she is supreme.
These tapes were from the pastor, Reverend Jeremiah Wright, a pastor at the black church that Obama attended in Chicago. You can imagine how well these tapes played in the mainstream media. Obama was repeatedly questioned as to why he hadn't left the church if the Reverend had said things like this. And what he did was actually quite interesting. Instead of just do the classic strategy that politicians always use when a scandal erupts, which is to deny, say you didn't know about this, disavow the Reverend, let it all blow over.
We have a choice in this country. We can accept a politics that breeds division and conflict and cynicism. We can tackle race only as spectacle, as we did in the OJ trial, or in the wake of tragedy, as we did in the aftermath of Katrina, or as fodder for the nightly news. We can play Reverend Wright sermons on every channel, every day, and talk about them from now until the election, and make the only question in this campaign whether or not the American people think that I somehow believe or sympathize with his most offensive words. We can pounce on some gaffe by a Hillary supporter as evidence that she's playing the race card. Or we can speculate on whether white men will all flock to John McCain in the general election, regardless of his policies. We can do that. But if we do, I can tell you that in the next election, we'll be talking about some other distraction. And then another one. And then another one. And nothing will change.
Obama did a very interesting and unusual thing. He went on television and he talked to people as though they were adults. Voters, specifically, the people least likely to be addressed as adults. Obama talked to voters as though they were full adults who could understand complex topics. And he talked to them about race. He said, look, I have a black pastor who gives sermons that to white America might sound hateful. I also have a white grandmother who says things that to black America seem racist. And in a sense, both of these things are true. I am the product of a country that has a longer and more violent history with race than perhaps any other country that has ever existed. But I am also the product of a mixed race family, and I am also aware that, as he says in a famous line,
that in no other country on earth is my story even possible.
So Obama, instead of running from Reverend Wright, gives a speech about the history of race in America. Now, it's impossible to actually communicate how rare and insane this choice was. Especially on matters of race. You do not respond to a scandal by giving the American people a lecture on the history of race in this country. And that's exactly what Obama did. And a lot of people thought it would fail. A lot of people thought that this was basically a suicide mission from the Obama campaign. And they said, look, there's no way this is going to work. You can't go on TV, give people a history lesson on race, and expect people to respond to you in a thoughtful and nuanced way. It's not going to happen. But it turns out that basically exactly what happened. Obama gave this speech on race, and his poll numbers actually improved. People were less concerned about the Reverend Wright scandal than they had been in previous weeks. He was basically able to give people a story that allowed them to contextualize what had happened, to not take it out of context and to just listen to sound bites. He actually gave people a history lesson on race in America that, in a sense, the country hadn't really received before from a major politician in any context, especially not one like the context Obama was operating in. For this reason alone, if for no other, the speech is this rare, amazing document that's worth viewing. The second speech we had to watch today was by Abraham Lincoln. This is Lincoln's second inaugural address, so he gets reelected in the midst of the American Civil War. And the election campaign is incredibly hard fought. Lincoln does, in fact, win re-election. And after he wins re-election, he gives a speech that becomes incredibly famous. It's one of those things like the Gettysburg Address that's really short, but just incredibly beautiful. Lincoln was super good at that. Has this famous line,
"Fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war shall speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
This is Lincoln attempting both to win a brutal civil war and to heal the country after winning a brutal civil war. It's one of the most famous moments in presidential speech-making history. What these speeches have in common? They're both related to a concept that I want to talk a little bit about today, called the bully pulpit. That basically points out that the president is able to give speeches to try to sway public opinion toward his viewpoint. A pulpit is a thing that you give a sermon from. And so this concept originates with Teddy Roosevelt, who it was said would use a bully pulpit to get Congress to do what he wanted. So he would meet with a lawmaker or another high official in government, and he'd say, look, I really want you to accomplish this specific thing. I want to, start the national park system. And people would say, well, Mr. President, we don't really want to do that for this, that, and the other reason. And he would say, okay, I'm sorry to hear that. I hope you'll reconsider. And then he would go out and give a big speech to a bunch of reporters. And he would say, I really think we should establish a public park system, don't you? And all of the press would give him favorable media coverage. And then after a few days, the congressman would call back and say, Mr. President, I've kind of rethought my previous position. Maybe the national parks are kind of a good idea after all. And so the president is essentially able to use his bully pulpit technique to get Congress to do what he wants. That is Lincoln. That is Obama's speech on race. and that is the Bully Pulpit. See you next time.